Okay, so we'll go ahead and get started. Thanks everyone for being here. We have over 100 people on the line, which is incredible. My name is Brandy Ryan. I'm the new staff attorney at the National Law Center on Homelessness and Poverty. This is my first webinar, so I hope that you will all bear with me if anything goes amiss. So a note for webinar logistics, everyone is muted, but there's a chat option, and you should see on your right-hand side control bar that there's a place for chat and questions if you have any questions along the way. I will do my best to field questions as we go, but for the sake of time, if there's anything that's pressing, I'll be sending out an email to follow up on the webinar, and that will include information about the reports and resources that will be in the presentation, and you can feel free to respond to that if you have any follow-up questions, any burning things that you would like answers to. So I want to start by saying that this webinar is going to be pretty basic, pretty surface level for if anyone is working in the homelessness space currently or in the homeless youth space. It might be a little boring, so I won't be offended if you mute me or tune out for a while, but there are a few things about resources and opportunities that are coming up at the Law Center that you might want to know about at the end. So I'm going to start by covering a little bit about homelessness in general, and then I'll move into legal challenges that face youth and children. Since it's back to school time, I'll spend a while on education rights, the obstacles that homeless children have in accessing public education, and the rights that they're legally guaranteed by the McKinney-Vento Act, and what they can do if schools deny those rights. Then I'll talk a little more about other legal challenges that homeless youth face, like being criminalized for running away from home and being denied access to basic services because of their age. Then our guest, Brooke, you've already heard from, will talk to you a little bit about her personal experience with homelessness and the things that she thinks are important for people in this space to know about. And finally, I will wrap up with some interesting ways that states and organizations are going about addressing some of the problems for homeless youth, and I'll highlight some resources both for education and McKinney-Vento problems and for general information about homelessness. Okay. So first we're going to talk about the background causes of homelessness. We're here to talk about children. We're going to talk about homelessness in general to begin with. Why do people become homeless? The leading cause of homelessness is low income and affordable housing, a lack of affordable housing. The disparity between income and affordable housing and housing cost means that there's nowhere in the United States that a person working a full-time minimum wage job can afford a two-bedroom apartment. In 20 states, a person has to make over $20 an hour to afford a two-bedroom apartment. And here, where we're based in Washington, D.C., which is one of the most expensive cities to live in, the salary that someone needs to make to afford a zero-bedroom studio apartment is $56,000 a year. And that's just a single person in a studio apartment. So income costs are clearly not keeping up with housing costs. Other causes of homelessness are health crises. They can decimate a person's savings and lead to job loss. Job loss itself, the economy, we all know what happened in 2008, and it's clear that anyone can find themselves suddenly without a job and unable to pay for their housing. Survivors of domestic violence, domestic abuse, since abusers and survivors often live together, a person fleeing domestic violence has to leave their home to escape the violence. So despite some legal protections that try to ensure that survivors can keep their housing in that sort of case, a lot of times the emergency situation is too immediate and women fleeing violence have to leave their home and their belongings. And so the cost to start over is extremely high. There's racial disparity across all of society, especially income inequality in the criminal system, and with the provision of social services, basically every aspect of life. All of these factors can keep people who are in poverty and communities that are in poverty from escaping that poverty. The last example I have here is natural disaster, a timely topic, I think. As we've seen with hurricanes, with wildfires, homes can be destroyed in a matter of minutes, and with entire cities losing their housing, picking up the pieces and rebuilding is such an incredible burden. So these are just some of the reasons that homelessness can happen. And I want to take a second to talk about misconceptions about what causes homelessness. We hear a lot about mental illness and addiction, and these are not leading causes of homelessness. These are things that, when intersected with homelessness, can perpetuate a cycle of chronic homelessness. But the leading cause of homelessness is really low income and unaffordable housing. So, who counts as homeless? Different government entities use different definitions of homelessness. HUD uses a few categories. You can see here, lacking fixed, regular, adequate nighttime residence, those who will imminently lose their nighttime residence, unaccompanied youth defined in other statutes, which we'll talk about with McKinney-Vento, and people fleeing domestic violence. The Department of Education uses a slightly different definition, which you can see here, and that includes transitional shelter. McKinney-Vento uses different definition, and other states and agencies can use their own definitions of homelessness. Since we're talking about children here, here's a little bit of background on child homelessness. 4.2 million children experience homelessness in a year. That's more people than live in the city of Los Angeles. So if homeless children were a city, they'd be the second largest city in the United States. You have a few stats here. A person is most likely to experience homelessness in infancy. 1 in 30 teens have experienced homelessness, 1 in 10 young adults. And I want to note here that often we talk about child and youth homelessness and we think of babies, we think of young children, but a lot of reports and a lot of organizations are treating 18 to 24 as the upper limit of youth. And it's, I think, a little easy to forget that this older group of youth are still youth that should be defined in this group of child and youth homelessness and the services they get, because these first few years of legal independence are so crucial to success in adulthood, and legal adulthood, is not quite the end-all be-all. So now we're going to move into education. The right to education for homeless children is so important because homeless children have poor attendance records. Moving around constantly and attending several different schools means they're more likely to drop out. Not finishing school means that they stay in a cycle of poverty. And school offers stability and services that they might not otherwise get at home, especially if homelessness means being really mobile. So some barriers to education for homeless children, along with that mobility, means people can constantly be moving from school district to school district. That can complicate things for people on the ground. While you'll see in a minute that that movement shouldn't affect a homeless child's school enrollment, the people who are actually dealing with the enrollment paperwork on the ground might not understand how that works. If you are homeless and too far from school, you may not have transportation to get there. The disruptions mean that you might not get to school every day. There are some other things here about the environment, clean clothes and school supplies. If you don't have those, you might stay home from school. So, I think no one is discounting the importance of going to school and having easy access to it. So, what we're really going to focus on today is the McKinney-Vento Homeless Assistance Act. This was passed in 1987. It established a lot of services for homelessness. It was the first and only, actually, major federal legislative response to homelessness. A few of the things it does, it established the Interagency Council on Homelessness. It established Title V. Its Title V created requirements that federal buildings that are being disposed of have to be offered for homeless service purposes. It created the Education of Homeless Children and Youth program, and some of its amendments went into greater detail in 1990 about the obligations of state and local education agencies in assuring that homeless children and youth have access to education. Now we're going to talk about the requirements of McKinney-Vento. This is the cover that you see here is the cover of a toolkit that we at the Law Center have created to help people assert their rights to education, to know what those rights are, and to fight for them when a school doesn't provide them. So first, who qualifies for McKinney-Vento rights? The McKinney-Vento definition of homelessness, like I said earlier, is a little bit different from HUD's. HUD's is more of a literal definition of homelessness. This version under McKinney-Vento is lacking a fixed, regular, adequate nighttime residence. That includes doubled up, living in hotels or motels, transitional shelters. It includes a nighttime residence that's not fit for sleeping, living in cars, parks, abandoned buildings, and it applies to everyone regardless of immigration status. So this includes things like living in a friend's house, couch surfing, and any school-age child can assert these rights, whether or not they have a guardian with them. So it's not either the parents of the students or the students themselves can assert these rights. But what rights am I talking about? So the rights that McKinney-Vento guarantees are school choice. That's the choice of school where your child enrolls. So they can either choose the school in the place that they currently live, or they can choose the school they attended before they became homeless. So that can keep continuity with schooling even when their housing situation becomes unstable. And even after a homeless family or child has found permanent housing, they can stay at that chosen school until the end of that school year. So finding permanent housing is not a barrier to continuity. The next right is immediate enrollment. That means that even if the school wants to dispute the status of being homeless or dispute the enrollment for some reason, they still have to enroll the student until the official decision is made. And then after, if that decision is appealed, then they've got to keep the student enrolled until the appeal is entirely finished. The next right is free transportation. As we talked about before, transportation can be a huge barrier to entry, especially if it's crossing school district lines. So a homeless child has the right to transportation to and from school. The school should provide this, and local laws might require that transportation be provided even after the child finds permanent housing. Next is school services. This includes all programs that the school offers, like sports, school activities, tutoring, gifted and talented programs, all extracurricular activities. It includes special education services, English language services, health referrals, help applying to and getting ready for college, programs that help provide clothing, uniforms, textbooks, career programs, and school nutritional programs. And that's not an exhaustive list. It really means all of the services that the school provides. The next right is no separation. That means that homeless students shouldn't be separated from other classmates. All the activities and classes and programs they participate in, they should be participating with everyone else. And lastly is privacy and confidentiality, which speaks for itself. But the school cannot contact other people to inquire about your homelessness status. So what do we do if the school violates those rights? You can file an appeal when a school makes a decision that you think is wrong with regards to homelessness status, the choice of school, the programs they can participate in. If they tell you that steps need to be taken before enrollment that violates the immediate enrollment right, if they refuse transportation, all of these mean that an appeal should be filed. The appeals process. So if a school makes a decision against a homeless child, they should provide written notice and notification that an appeal is available. So this, as I said before, the student has to remain enrolled in school until the process is done. Anyone who's appealing should be aware that there might be deadlines, and they should collect evidence for their case. That means if the school thinks that you're not homeless, you should collect information about your housing situation. We have paper versions of these toolkits and PDFs that we'll be sending out, and those have got a long list of potential evidence and evidence that you might want to tailor if you have specific housing situations. We've got a list that's things like if you're couch surfing, if your house is overcrowded, if your housing is unsafe, and what kind of evidence that you would want to bring to prove those things. You don't need a lawyer for these kinds of appeals, but people who have lawyers do fare better in these decisions. And we've got some resources that can help you find a lawyer if that's the sort of thing you're looking for. So every school has a homeless liaison, and every state has a state coordinator for these issues. You can find a list of state coordinators at the website here, nche.ed.gov/data. And those people can help through this process. If they don't, then you can find a lawyer by getting in touch with some of these organizations. The ABA has a homeless youth network, the National Center for Homeless Education, us, the National Law Center on Homelessness and Poverty, and Schoolhouse Connection. And I wanted to make a note that Schoolhouse Connection announced today that their 2020 to 2021 Youth Scholarship Program is open for applications. That's for children experiencing homelessness, and if you want more information about that, you can get in touch with me later. So, in addition to education challenges, there are very many other legal challenges facing children and youth. The general criminalization of homelessness applies to youth as much as it applies to anyone else. This means punishing people for basic life activities. It includes panhandling, asking for help, living in vehicles. Some cities have bans on camping, on sitting down in public. And there are obviously bans on things like public urination and defecation. And all of these are things that would be perfectly legal if you did them inside your home. But the status of being homeless makes them illegal. For youth specifically, the Law Center worked with True Colors United to make this report the State Index on Youth Homelessness. It looks at all 50 states and DC and gives it a grade based on more than 60 metrics relating to the rights that unaccompanied homeless youth have. And it gives some recommendations for improvement. None of the states passed this test. So, you know, that's an indication of how we're doing. There's a little bit of a focus in this report on LGBTQ youth because they have a 120% higher chance of becoming homeless than anyone else. So you'll see quite a few metrics here that focus homelessness services on that group. So some of the things that this report found, these are some gaps in law and policy. So several states don't have a robust grievance procedure for McKinney-Vento, even though it's required by law. You can see here, only 5 provide for partial credit accrual. That means when children are transferring between schools or have disruptions in their education, most states don't allow them to use that credit, so those students are set back every time they have to go to a new school. Only 6 states assist with accessing higher education for homeless students, and almost everywhere, truancy is a crime. So you can imagine as an unaccompanied homeless youth that it might not be the easiest to get to school and still afford to live, but criminalizing truancy is effectively criminalizing someone for their age. Some other things in law and policy. It's a crime in some states simply to run away. So that means as soon as someone steps out the door with the intent of not coming back to their home, they've committed a crime. It's also a crime to harbor runaway youth, which means that even if they have a person they can go to, if they have a house they can stay in, that person might still get in trouble simply for offering a bed. You can see a few more things here. There are very few plans for exiting the criminal justice system, and most, even those that do have plans, few of them have plans for housing after exiting the criminal system. because they're minors, the state of being a minor means that in many places, youths can't contract. That means they can't sign leases. They can't do any legal contracts. There are barriers for support services where shelters have minimum ages, or you might need a parental consent for health services. And in a lot of places, that minimum age requirement applies to federal assistance too. So young people can't access SNAP benefits or TANF where they are. Some systemic barriers. These are things that are sort of in the way of creating good policy. So this is really about the framework that different states have. 11 states don't have a plan to address youth homelessness. Only 4 have an agency focused solely on youth homelessness. So you can see the barrier there when it comes to getting good policy passed. There's no one dedicated to that job. Environmental challenges are ones. Here's where you see the focus on LGBTQ issues. Most states don't require training about this. There's very little promotion of safe environments for LGBT youth in shelters, in healthcare, in the criminal system. And there's very little public awareness campaigning about the issue of youth homelessness. So in some places, people may not even realize how big of an issue this is. But remember that I said 1 in 10 youth have experienced homelessness by the ages 18 to 24. So this is, if people aren't hearing about it, then this is a really huge invisible problem. Key recommendations from the state index. So these are ways that states can fix what's wrong with their law and policy. Specific steps to support LGBTQ youth, prohibiting discrimination on the basis of orientation and gender identity. They can also help to assuage that age discrimination, or not necessarily discrimination, but the closing of doors to people of certain ages. Self-governing youth action boards are groups or advisory boards of young people to help bring the youth voice into the conversation and tell us what really needs to happen. So at this point, I'm going to kick it over to our guest, Brooke. Brooke Evans is a friend of the Law Center and a recent graduate from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. She experienced homelessness, housing insecurity, and financial precarity variably throughout her college career over the span of 7 years. Brooke has contributed to some of the most well-known research we have available today on the basic needs and instability in higher education. She published work and presented on her experience to the Domestic Policy Council under Barack Obama. And she's continued to influence policy with her most recent contribution, helping homeless youth access higher education and housing in writing policy for Democratic presidential candidate Secretary Julian Castro. Brooke is going to talk a little bit about her experience and about the things that she thinks that people new to this space should know about, and the things that would be most helpful for us as the service sector going forward. Brooke, please take it away.
Thank you, Brandy. Hi, y'all. My name is Brooke. So I'm very happy to be with you all today. I'm a little bit nervous, so please forgive me here. I'm just very excited to be here. So as Brandy kind of shared, over the course of 7 years, beginning in 2010 and then culminating finally in my degree in 2017, I experienced different arrangements and variable conditions of homelessness, housing insecurity, and certainly just the everyday reality of being a low-income person throughout those 7 years, both while a student and for about a year and a half as a dropout, because unfortunately that is something that's not uncommon for folks coming from, our experience, coming into higher education where institutions aren't necessarily conducive to our well-being or our success. And so much of my life and work since becoming an adult really has been dedicated to establishing our right to an education that's accessible for us when we don't have, the housing privilege, perhaps like the next person. In my personal experience at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, it is, an upper-class school, I would say, middle-class to upper-class institution. So there certainly aren't a lot of Pell Grant eligible students like myself. We are a minority, and we're well below the national average, actually, as of a few years ago. So in my experience, one of the key things that Brandy highlighted that I'm pleased to be helping address with Secretary Castro is this lack of a consistent government-wide definition, because one of the things that I struggled with most was having to essentially deal with the discretion of every single individual or department, like the departments of financial aid. They all have so much discretion, almost unfettered discretion, to adjudicate on your financial aid eligibility. They can require different documentation from you. So, some documentation that would work at UW-Madison might not work at Columbia, might not work at a regional school, elsewhere. It's all quite different. And what happened to me was that I was required to provide information all the way back to elementary school, and, as early as about kindergarten, even though I was, at 20 years old. By the time I entered UW-Madison. So it was just quite a lot. I felt that my financial aid department knew more about me than any human being currently alive. So it was incredibly frustrating, I felt very vulnerable, and I felt very judged, because that was something that I also struggled with is, our institution didn't have single point of contact. We didn't have a McKinney-Vento liaison, which is something I try to work on now. And we didn't have anyone in the administrative level who could have told you what their definition of homelessness was, and it certainly wouldn't have matched the next person, because my university didn't have a working definition. In fact, when I would talk about my experience being homeless with professors and staff, what they told me to do was leave. By one dean in particular, which I've certainly talked about before, told me that if I'm having trouble with affording housing in college, I should leave, because that's indicative of a personal problem or a family problem, certainly some mark of deficiency, delinquency, disability or dishonesty, and that I had no business being there. In fact, I was told to leave my university and go to a community college where I would, quote unquote, find more people like me there. So I was made very well aware, all the way at the chancellor's level, that I really wasn't welcome where I was. And so, of course, that led to me leaving school because they told me to leave. I took their advice. So I was homeless as a dropout for a year and a half, which is by far the most difficult experience of my life, but the most formative one. By the time that I finally got back to college and was accepted as a returning student, I came very prepared. My goal was to socially renovate my institution. So one of the things that I would certainly recommend that Brandy has already echoed, and I didn't realize we had so many of these policy priorities in common because I was new to the world of homeless advocacy at that time, but certainly streamlining the definition. And I would really encourage y'all to connect with financial aid departments because they have so much institutional discretion to decide whether or not homeless youth get financial aid. In my experience, because I was an independent student, independent by virtue of homelessness, which is a whole process that students usually go through called a dependency override process. which itself is very problematic and difficult. That's the process that required me to provide so much documentation all the way back to elementary school. We had financial aid programs at my institution that barred independent students and transfer students from being eligible. And when homeless students are largely independent students in college, you're barring homeless students from the kind of grant funding that would provide them housing. So instead of being provided grant funding to afford housing as a homeless student, I instead had to acquire thousands and thousands and thousands in debt. So certainly one of my favorite things that I ever worked on was going all the way to DC to advocate with the Senate Help Committee to go ahead and change that financial aid program to essentially create debt-free free college at UW-Madison for low-income students and homeless students in my position. So though I'm battling with my debt now, I'm certainly well served every day by the notion that other students are not going through that. And some other things that I would definitely recommend are, sure, I can't think of a better way to say this other than to put your head on a swivel. When I came back to college, I came back with a sincere desire to investigate absolutely every aspect of what my life meant as a homeless person. So what was my access to food? We didn't have a food pantry. My institution didn't accept SNAP on campus. It wasn't just that I, couldn't eat like my peers in content. I couldn't eat near my peers, which of course harkens back to what Brandy said in terms of the segregation of homeless students from their peers. I would go into class and be made fun of in public by my professors because of my lack of a coat or lack of boots or lack of different clothing, and be made fun of by my peers for the way that they felt I presented myself or smelled or, acted. And I often came up against staff who had the notion that they uttered out loud that all homeless students in college are just mentally ill people, and which they'd uttered in news conferences and interviews. So it was understanding that I was coming up against a wide-ranging disconnect on what it meant to be homeless, who becomes homeless, and there was no well flushed out and robust belief that I had a right to an education. I think institutions, unfortunately, when they work in discretion off the radar without much oversight or accountability, really, is they believe that if you're homeless in college, that's a kind of natural weeding out. It determines who and who is not good enough, which of course has no bearing on someone's value or worth for an education or their capability for that matter. And also in my personal experience becoming homeless as an adult, in the end of the spectrum of 18 to 24 there, I wasn't served directly by McKinney-Vento in my interactions with folks. So having that consistent government-wide definition that accounts for variable arrangements extending throughout the ages is really key. And to certainly many other aspects, it's simple as if you investigate and look into the FAFSA, even in the way, which is a free financial aid, application for applying for federal aid in higher education, even the way they define homelessness is vastly different than these other agencies do. So when I even first filled out the FAFSA, I didn't understand if I was homeless because they only would consider, if you lived in a shelter. And I couldn't live in a shelter because I'm disabled and I have an assistance animal. And there were no pet-friendly, quote-unquote, pet-friendly shelters in the entire state of Wisconsin, which is another project we had to take on. So it was failure after failure, culminating into, in my experience, failing out of college and having to come back, still having a very difficult time. But some other things I would really encourage are creating institutional assessments. That was one of my favorite things I did when I became a researcher, is creating assessments nationally as instruments, but also especially for my school that I could then share with other schools like the Big Ten Conference of which we're a part, to finally, address on the record and assess on the record the reality of this problem, that it's a problem that needs addressing. And as Brandy echoed, and sort of as we know now in data, unsurprisingly, students most affected are students of color, disabled students, and LGBTQ youth in college, even at my institution. So it's just very, very relatable data. I think, rather than go on here, because I know Brandy, trying to cap it at maybe 10 minutes, Brandy, is there anything else you'd like me to expound on? I can certainly make myself available for anyone and everyone and share my resources and experiences further. Brandy, is there anything else you'd like me to touch on?
Nothing from me, but I will be sending out Brooke's email address if anyone has specific things that they want to follow up on, or if people want to send questions through me, that's fine too. Thank you so much, Brooke, for sharing your experience with us.
Yes, thanks for having me on.
Okay, so I'm just going to do a little bit of wrap up here. The state index that we were talking about before noted some notable practices that I want to point out. The New York Runaway and Homeless Youth Act is a framework for providing shelter and services. And some of the interesting things that it does is allowing for raising the maximum age for youth services to 24. It allows for lowering the minimum age for transitional and independent living so that teens younger than 16 can still participate in these things. And it allows for extending the maximum length of stay in transitional living programs to keep youth housed for as long as possible. Washington State has a state office of homeless youth. So the service areas here are what they focus on: stable housing, family reconciliation, especially because a lot of youth become homeless because they get kicked out of their homes. And with LGBTQ youth, we see that a lot when families don't accept children for who they are. They focus on creating permanent connections with people because when you're living homeless, it can be so transitory. They focus on education and employment and social and emotional well-being. They also have funding for youth-specific programs, specific residential centers, and youth services. And finally, I wanted to mention Close-Knit. It's an innovative solution that the Law Center is going to partner with soon. Close-Knit focuses on informal hosting situations. So this is the sort of situation where a child or youth becomes homeless, but they have a family or family friend, not their own family. They have a family friend, someone who's willing to take them in. And this can create various legal issues, especially if, say, the host family is renters. So if a homeless youth stays with them for a long time, they could be violating their lease agreement. So Close-Knit offers youth drop-in centers where they help mediate shared expectation agreements, and that's between the youth and their host families, and it can also include landlords, and it can include social services, so that everyone is on the same page, and that so that these sort of relationships can get the support they need. I have the email address here for Jacqueline White, who runs Close-Knit. She and the Law Center are partnering together to start a working group looking at this issue and how we can start to creatively solve the legal problems here. So if you're interested, you can email Jacqueline or you can email me, and we'll be including this in the follow-up email as well. You've seen these already, but I just wanted to reiterate these resources for McKinney-Vento education disputes. I will also send out this information. And finally, these are some resources that the Law Center has created around youth homelessness. Alone Without a Home is a state-by-state review of laws in specific issue areas that affect the lives of unaccompanied homeless youth. The Homeless Youth Handbook, as you can see, there are only a few states here. The ones that are listed here in DC are the only ones that are up now, but the idea is really for this to be used by youth to come and find specific issues that they're facing and have a quickly accessible resource for the laws in their state. We also have the McKinney-Vento toolkits, like I said. I will be sending those around, and so there's a federal toolkit and a New York State toolkit, and the federal one should cover most of what's applicable to all the states. But that will be sent around, and it's really just a paper version of what I told you here today. And this is the state index. It's got much, much more than I was able to talk about today. So you can find that. I will send the link to that as well. I will wrap up here. We do have a couple polls, though. If you could stay for just 1 second and tell us if you've learned anything and if you'll be able to use this information as you go forward. If there are any questions or anything else you want to know, please don't hesitate to get in touch. I'll be sending a follow-up email with my contact information and all the other contact information and reports that you saw here today.
Brandy, did you want me to launch the poll?
Oh, yes, that would be great. Thank you.
All right, so folks could click on the poll here. We're just wondering if today's webinar provided you with a better understanding of the laws affecting unaccompanied youth. We'll give it about 10 more seconds for people to enter their votes. All right, I'm going to close it shortly. All right. So we're glad to see that almost all of you learned at least something today, and that's great to see. And we'd love to know if you're likely to use this information or the resources that we talked about going forward. So if you can vote on that. We'll leave it up for another couple seconds. All right, closing shortly. Thanks, and again, looks like lots of folks indicating that these resources will be useful for folks, so that's wonderful. Brandy, did you want to address any of the questions that came in?
Sorry, my window is showing my questions so tiny. Oh, so will we be sending a PowerPoint at the end of the webinar? We will be sending, this was recording as a video, so we'll send out the recording of the video when we've got it up. I can also send the link to the presentation. There are a few technical questions here that I think are better for me to answer offline, but no CLE credits for this webinar. Everyone else with specific questions, I'll try to answer them as much as possible in my follow-up email. All right.
Okay,
Anything else
great.
from you, Garrett? All right, thanks so much for coming, everyone.